Okay, we're here with Jaci Kettler, assistant professor at Boise State in the School of Public Service. Hi, Jaci. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Hi, glad to join.
Great. I always start off the interviews by asking people to tell us a little bit about how you ended up here and a little bit about you.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Kansas, and as an undergrad, I did an internship in the Kansas State Senate, which I loved. I got to hang out on the floor, see what's going on, and it just sparked a lot of questions for me. Like, why is this happening? And especially a lot of questions about the role of the party and the party caucus and what was happening. And so I think my professors kind of identified that curiosity and started to encourage me to think about grad school. And so that's how I kind of ended up on the path. And I've always been interested in teaching. So once I learned more about what academia was and political science research, then it just made a lot of sense to kind of look to go to grad school and study state politics.
And you did that at Rice. Yeah, with actually one of Gary Moncrief's frequent co-authors, right? Keith Ham?
I did, yeah. I wanted to study with someone who studied comparative state, especially legislatures. At that time, I was really interested in the legislatures. And so Rice just made a lot of sense in that what he was studying, the types of scholars that he was advising ended up at places that I would be interested in working at. And so I spent 6 years at Rice. And then thankfully, as I was finishing up there, the Boise State position came open, which is because Gary Moncrief was retiring, and it was just seemed like a perfect fit.
And it has been. You've been an excellent addition to the faculty, in my opinion, anyway. And I'm so glad that you're here. So today we're going to talk about political parties and the practice of people who are already elected giving money to each other. Can you talk a little bit about that generally?
Yeah, I think once I started to learn more about candidate-to-candidate donations at the congressional level, I was just fascinated because, candidates spend a lot of time and energy fundraising. It's often one of the main reasons people say they don't want to run for office is because they don't want to fundraise. So the idea that they're fundraising not just for their own campaign, but then actually giving it to the party or other candidates, I found just fascinating.
Sorry about that. I forgot to mention the dogs will often,
Okay. Should I start over or just pick up? Okay. And so the idea that candidates were using their, precious resources to give to the party and other candidates really fascinated me. At the congressional level, there is research by scholars like Heberleg and Larson and Kahn at Utah State that congressional members that donate more to the party caucus and other members are more likely to become legislative leaders. And what's happened is basically like there's an institutionalized role for money now in Congress, and that if you want to be a leader or a committee chair, you really have to be fundraising huge amounts and redistributing it to the party and other members. So that really sparked some interest in whether that was happening at the state level. But beyond that, I was interested in, there's a lot of focus in the congressional research on how much money they were giving, but I thought that it could matter who they're donating to. And so maybe how candidates are, who they're giving to or how they're distributing that money may make a difference for whether or not this is a successful path to being a leader.
And in your study of 6 states, how did you pick the 6 that you ended up with?
Yeah, I started off with a larger sample of states, or at least a goal of larger sample, but network analysis, which is what I do in this paper, requires really, it's kind of picky in the data. The data has to be formatted, set up in a certain way, and has to be very clean. And so just preparing the data for that network analysis required such time-intensive work that I ended up with selecting just to go with 6 states. And I tried to select a diverse set. And so states that varied in terms of things like legislative professionalism or how much partisan competition is in the state, so that I could make sure that I was getting states where there might be different incentives for giving to the party caucuses or the party committees and other candidates.
Okay, that's great. In public administration, we talk about network analysis, but usually we're talking about a service delivery network, right? You know, like the daisy chain of federal money to the state, to local, to nonprofits and things like that. Is it similar in the kind of methodology you're using and the thoughts about when it works and when it doesn't, or is it its own thing?
Well, so one thing that's happened in the study of political parties is we're really changing our definitions and conceptualizations of parties to be networks, and that they're networks of actors and interest groups and organizations that cooperate to achieve shared goals. But it's a little different than thinking about the party just as like the state party committee and some county committees and a local committee. Instead, we're broadening it up, thinking about the role of teachers unions or the NRA in this party coalition or network. And so we've seen this movement of how we define parties to be more in line with the network approach. And so I think increasingly scholars are adopting the methodology to fit with our theoretical changes of how we conceptualize parties. But it's also a way to actually evaluate and measure connections and relationships. And for me, my thought was that when candidates donate to other candidates, they create a friendship or a relationship, right? And so there's an expressive benefit of that action. And so I wanted to be able to actually study those donations as kind of the basis of a relationship or a connection. And so network analysis allows us to do that because we don't have to assume each unit is independent or each observation is independent. Like we get to examine it together and those connections together.
And so do we find that the money moves multiple times, if you could trace a marked dollar bill or whatever, that it's actually going to end up in several different legislative coffers or party treasure chests over the course of the electoral cycle?
For sure. And that gets a little hard to trace, right? Because, I mean, I kind of joke that sometimes there's like some money laundering happening in our campaign finance system. And so it does get a little hard to follow through. But one thing we see is that, like, say you're the Speaker of the House, you might fundraise, donate money to the party legislative committee, and then that committee redistributes that money to candidates in competitive races. And so what the party wants to happen is to redistribute money from like safe incumbents to those in competitive races, because the party doesn't care about spending a lot of money in races where the incumbent's likely to win. They want to focus the money on competitive races that matter. And so what we can see is it kind of helps a more efficient use of money in some ways. And so by encouraging members and candidates to do this, by rewarding them with legislative influence or leadership positions, it helps encourage that giving.
So in a state that's lopsided like we are here in Idaho, where there are so many more Republicans successfully elected than Democrats, I think around 85%, something like that, of the legislative seats are held by Republicans. Does that change the way that works, since so few of the legislative races are competitive?
Yeah, so one thing I find in my dissertation, and this paper is kind of an extension of my dissertation, but in my dissertation, I do a lot of more comparisons of the state party networks themselves. And one thing I find is that these networks are denser and there's more connections as measured by the donations in states that are more competitive. And so in a state like Oklahoma, where there wasn't a lot of competition, one party dominated, there's not a lot of candidate-to-candidate donations. And so that's kind of true here in Idaho as well. I haven't studied it as in depth, but it's not as common for these candidate-to-candidate donations. However, there are some interesting uses in the Republican Party that breaks down by ideology. So you can kind of see, some of those more mainstream or business-centric Republicans donating to each other, and then you've got some of the sharing kind of happening on the farther right.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if I'm going to try here to show the, let's see. I may not be smart enough to do this. I was going to show the network analysis chart that you have. And for some reason, I'm not finding the shared screen.
It's the green button at the bottom.
Oh, let me move. Maybe it's maybe I'm in the way. Yep. Nope.
I think I can do it if you want me
If
to.
please do, if you can do it,
Oh,
that would.
You disabled screen sharing.
I did. Wait. Is it back now? No. Oh, that's funny. Okay. How do I even?
I'm not.
I got it. There we go. Allow participants to share screen. How about that? Does that work now? Yeah. So it's fascinating. It looks a little bit like pictures of COVID-19 or the coronavirus. Tell us what we're seeing here.
Yeah, so what I did was I created these networks using the donations, right? And so a donation is a connection. So once you make a donation to a candidate or a party, that is that measure, that's how I identify the relationship. And so these networks, which are for Iowa, are what is the result of these. And so if you donated to another actor, there's a connection. I tried to, and in this paper, I'm interested in candidates, right, and their position and influence in the party. So I'm highlighting in the dark blue and the light blue women and men candidates. And we can see, at least in Iowa, that a lot of the candidates are kind of near the middle or the center of the network, which makes sense, right? Because most donations are going to go through parties. Or I mean, the candidates are the ones receiving the donations and giving the donations. And so that's why we see them in more of a central area. I was also interested in whether women candidates look like their position any different than men. And at least when we look at the networks, no clear differences jump out, right? Which is why the visual networks are a great place to start, but you don't want to make like conclusions off of them because they can be kind of manipulated how you display network graphs, but they also are just kind of a starting point to look at, to evaluate. I needed to then move forward in some statistical analysis to really dive into it.
So there are occasionally these dots represented on these graphs that are kind of off by themselves, and I would assume those are the people that are perhaps on the ideological fringe of that party, maybe.
So it could be. I mean, at least in my graphs, and I actually should know I took out the isolated actors that weren't connected to anyone else. So those people would be people who just donated to themselves. They're self-donor, self-fundraising. They didn't donate to anyone else. They got removed. Here, what's going to happen is if you're giving more donations or receiving more donations, you're going to be more central. And so those that are on the periphery just aren't receiving many donations or didn't give very many, or only gave a lot connected to like one or two people. And so that could align with ideology. I didn't test that in my research. You would expect there could be some differences. And I did find some kind of observational evidence in my dissertation that like the Tea Party was kind of off in its own little area of Republican networks, but I didn't dive into that in great depth just because I had some other questions that I was trying to evaluate first.
So in the summary results of this analysis, you find that that there is some connection between women sharing money with other candidates and becoming leaders or being leaders in the legislature. Is that correct?
That is correct. Do you want me to show the results, or just in screen?
Sure, sure.
Okay. Here we go. Did that look, is that
Yep.
viewable? Okay. Once I did screen sharing, it messed my screen all the way up, so I can't. Okay. Yeah, so in this paper, I was interested in whether men and women have, like, if they both can use this potential path to leadership by redistributing funds to the party and other candidates. We know that women are less likely to become legislative leaders. There are some states that don't have any women in legislative leadership positions. And so I thought what might happen is that candidates can use this redistribution to form like their own network, almost challenging kind of the old boys network through redistribution of money, and so that they could kind of benefit themselves through this mechanism. And so I use a network measure, which was developed by Ronald Burke, called the constraint score, which is evaluating, it's a kind of a composite score looking at things like diversity of who you're connected to. Are you connected to a lot of people, a few people? Are you connected to unique people? Are you connecting people who are not connected to each other? And so in a way, what we refer to this is a measure of brokerage. So if you're a broker, and another way, it's just if you have diverse connections. And so I use that constraint score to evaluate whether candidates can use this redistribution to become leaders. And in this logistic regression, I find that candidates who have a lower constraint score, in the results, I find that candidates with higher constraint scores, so they have less diverse connections, are less likely to become legislative leaders. So if you have a lower constraint score, that's going to make you more likely to become a legislative leader. I include both chamber leadership and committee leadership in my measure of leaders. But interestingly, there's some differences between men and women, in that for men, seniority matters for both Republican and Democratic men, but it doesn't matter for women. And so again, this is suggesting that women might be using this as an alternative path, since other paths to leadership are less open to them. And we also find that the coefficient is much larger, the effect is much larger on constraint score for women compared to men. And so as a result, I think this is a really interesting demonstration of where there's, women are trying to enter or break into power and influence, but they have to kind of go about it differently than what's already available for men.
Yeah. So they have to be more diverse in their, I'm trying to make sure that I make the connection to the broker role, right?
Yeah, so I think what's happening is that, and I tried to demonstrate this through a few different sorts of analysis in the paper, is that women candidates are working hard to donate to diverse or influential actors in the party network, which is then helping them gain leadership down the road, because this is leadership in the subsequent session post the 2012 election. And one thing I find is that looking at degree, so how many donations women compared to men are giving, women give on average more donations to other party actors than men candidates do. So again, I think women are working harder to diversify their connections in the network, in the party network, through the redistribution of funds, which is kind of interesting. And it works for men too, but it's either men don't need it as much and they already benefit from things like seniority, so they, or in the old boys club, whatever's going on, that they don't need it as much, or they're not as strategic about it as women might be. And I did find some examples when I was working on this research of these women state legislators that would fundraise so much and give huge amounts, or like huge number of donations to other actors, and then really did use that to kind of move themselves up. And so I think it's just really interesting that even though a lot of, especially women, will identify not wanting to raise money as a reason to not run for office, that it's actually a real opportunity for women to improve their influence by raising a lot of money and giving it to other candidates in the party.
No, what I'm about to say is pure conjecture. Your data won't include the answer to this, but I'm reminded that at least many years ago, when we looked at who runs for the legislature, that the men were coming from more traditional routes, like maybe they'd held a previous elected office or something, a county commissioner or something like that. Whereas women tended to come in from the nonprofit sector, like they were a volunteer in something in their, in their community, and then they get interested or someone talks them into running for the legislature. And if your path to elected office is through that philanthropic community where fundraising is everything, right? It doesn't exist without that. I wonder if they're just more accustomed to having to build those networks from that experience.
I agree completely. I think because women often have a different path to office and come up through different networks, they're not, some women are very connected to the business kind of, or legal set of communities that really bring in, a lot of candidates. But I think that women they are a little bit of outsiders still. And because they come from education or nonprofit or just ways that are not usually the typical networks of power and influence for politics, that women are having to do a little bit more work on creating their own networks and connections to really be able to bring themselves in contention for leadership positions.
It's a great piece of research, Jaci. I'm so glad you're able to share with us about it. Do you have any thoughts about the state of the parties here in Idaho?
I think our Idaho parties are really fascinating, right? I think a lot of times there's so much attention on states with competitive party elections. And I think that often one-party states can be very interesting as well, because here we have such fascinating divisions within the Republican Party that continue to make a difference for elections and governing. And then in the Democratic Party, you have also some interesting ideological tensions, which in a smaller party is also kind of been fascinating to watch as they try to figure out if they're going to go a bit more progressive or more moderate to try to appeal to more people. And so I think both parties are experiencing some interesting ideological tensions.
Absolutely. When I came here a long time ago, they told me there were lunch bucket Democrats, that were up in the Panhandle, the old Union vote, right? The people that worked in the sawmills and the paper mills and all that, who probably since the Reagan years have not regularly voted Democrat, but they were there. And then there were the wine and cheese Democrats that were sort of the Blaine County, high education, second home rich people kind of thing. But I think those distinctions have evaporated and formed instead more of is this a progressive movement, or are we trying to maybe capture the large number of independents in the state?
Especially with a focus on education. I think that's been one area where Democrats have some appeal in the state, or that's maybe a little unfair, but I think their positions on education have been an area that they've been able to identify that they can appeal to a broad population. And, but there again, it's like, well, how do we have that and, actually compete in some elections, but also have increasingly our base more and more progressive and wanting views that are not going to appeal to even moderate Republicans who maybe are increasingly unhappy with education in the state.
In my observation is in the last several general elections, the highest number of Democrat votes statewide is for the superintendent of public instruction. That's usually the closest statewide race. And so I think your point is right on there. Jaci, thanks again for taking time to be with us, and stay healthy. And today, I don't know when we'll be watching this exactly, but it's very hot today. So stay inside and enjoy the cool air conditioning if you can. Yeah.
Thanks for having me. Happy to chat.
Thanks, Jaci. See ya.